So, what are the Russians and Ukrainians up to again? Russia has called on foreigners to leave, is launching more strikes, and calls it retaliation. We have another article here from IDNS, as well as from other newspapers, talking about how Russia is making very explicit threats, saying that a major strike is coming. And it's not just a line in the mainstream media or something that Lavrov is spreading. This is all over the Russian military internet as well. Here, for example, we have a report from Fighter Bomber, who is one of those very radical and very aggressive Russian military bloggers, who is often even more Catholic than the Pope. In other words, he spreads even harsher nonsense than Medvedev or the official Russian narrative. And that's basically what he's saying, that in response to the Ukrainian attack on Starobilsk, which we'll definitely take a look at, there will be more strikes. That Oreshnik and that the wave of 90 missiles and 600 drones that came the day before yesterday is just the beginning. That there will be massive destruction of Kyiv, decision-making centers, factories, warehouses, and all these things, government buildings and other things, as revenge for this so-called terrorist act. And according to his estimate, Kyiv should be leveled to the ground or made uninhabitable in about a month. So this is what Fighter Bomber writes. That is a nationalist, ultra-nationalist Russian military blogger. Basically, it's not a very good source of information, but it's a good source, let's say, for the mood among Russian nationalists and what they're actually latching onto, the most fanatical supporters of this war. And we can also see what kind of propaganda line is being pushed, namely that Starobilsk was clearly an attack on civilians, and a clearly targeted attack on civilians. Starobilsk, a city in the occupied Luhansk region, was indeed a very, very strange incident. Basically, it could be described as happening on the night of the 21st. From May 21st to May 22nd, there was an attack by more than 16 drones on this building, which, according to Russian information, was supposed to serve as a dormitory for the local pedagogical school. There were supposed to be over 80 students there, mostly girls aged 14 to 19. And after the Ukrainians attacked it with 16 drones, 21 of these girls were supposed to have died, and there were more casualties. Dozens and dozens were seriously injured, and that's also why, according to reports from Russia, the number of dead kept rising. But that's normal when you have an attack on a building full of people. It collapses, and you simply find them, or unfortunately, the wounded die. So this is basically the Russian game, the Russian card they're playing, and how they present it, as if it was a Ukrainian attack on civilian infrastructure, where 21 children died, 21 girls, basically young girls. As for the Ukrainian explanation of this action, they deny that they attacked a civilian target. They claim that there were no girls in that building, in that dormitory. There were no students from the pedagogical school, but instead the leadership of the Rubicon drone unit, or the Rubicon headquarters, was there, which are actually elite Russian drone operators. With the aim of destroying these drone operators, those 16 drones attacked the building, and honestly, at this moment, it's impossible to determine whether there were actually little girls in the building, or if there were soldiers, or if it was a combination, if half the building was soldiers and the other half was little girls. This is something that cannot be independently verified. Basically, it's shrouded in the fog of war, and you'll never find out. You'll never find out, but based on logic and the nature of the situation, since we don't have any convincing evidence from OSINT, meaning independent verifiers, that it was only a civilian target, but at the same time we don't have any independent confirmation that it was only a military target, there simply isn't any information about this. We have to focus on the logic of the attack. The logic of the attack suggests that the Ukrainians really thought they were attacking military personnel. I'm not saying it was a military target 100%, because you can't say that, right? But I'm saying that the Ukrainians definitely weren't attacking with the goal of killing civilians. They were attacking with the goal of killing Russian drone operators. How did I figure that out? It's simple, because the attack uses the modus operandi, the way Ukrainians operate when they want to destroy a specific building where there are some conflicts. conflicts involving a specific military unit. In other words, they used a large number of drones from different directions, and that's why the building looks like this. And that's also why, if there were any girls there, there had to be, or could have been, so many victims. Yeah, because the real goal was to shoot up the building and totally eliminate as many Russian soldiers inside as possible. If it were a targeted attack on civilians, first of all, it wouldn't make any sense at all. And secondly, usually when there are attacks on civilians or when terror is used against civilians, which, by the way, the Russians do much more often than the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians are aware that attacking civilians, especially in the Luhansk region, is not strategically interesting, important, or a good move. So when there is an attack and terror is spread against civilians, usually 1 or 2 drones are used, and most of the time they're sent to Moscow or to some actual Russian city. There really is no reason why the Ukrainians would so brutally and deliberately kill civilians in Luhansk like this. In reality, there isn't even any confirmation or precedent that they would do this in Moscow either. But if they were to do it anywhere, they would probably try it in Moscow, or in Belgorod, or in Kursk, rather than here in Luhansk. So, regarding that attack, yeah, it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible, you can't verify it, that the Ukrainians targeted the wrong place, that they were deceived by the Russians, who often hide their soldiers in civilian buildings and mixed civilian and military buildings, and so they just sent in drones to destroy the soldiers without knowing that the girls were there. That could have easily happened. However, that's not really what we wanted to talk about today. We wanted to talk about why Russia is evacuating its diplomats, its people from Kyiv, and why it's calling on international organizations to leave Kyiv as well. And it's precisely because of this threat that Kyiv will be destroyed and become uninhabitable. Here we have, for example, another article from Czech television. Russia has announced new strikes on Kyiv and is urging foreigners to leave. So there's a lot of this. The media is full of it. And people are already speculating about what it could be, what the Russians might do. First of all, I would instantly rule out a nuke. Yeah, a nuclear weapon. Just forget about that. That's something the Russians won't go for. That's a closed chapter. Basically, they know very well what China's position is regarding the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They know very well what NATO would do to the Russian Baltic Fleet if the Russians used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, even a tactical one. So in this regard, you can completely rule out nuclear weapons. They will not be used. What can be done, and what the Kremlin is already threatening, of course, is that they could use more targeted missile strikes, more frequent drone attacks focused mainly on Kyiv, with the aim of demoralizing and intimidating the population of Kyiv, the center of power. Lavrov said they will attack centers of power, meaning government buildings, as far as I know, the president's offices, ministries, command centers, and so on. At the same time, he said they will attack the military-industrial complex, meaning they will mainly target drone factories or workshops where drones are made. They will look for factories where missiles are produced and generally where weapons are manufactured. In this regard, I wouldn't expect any fundamentally different events than what we've witnessed in the past. The Russians have now fired their missiles. They used some Oreshnik. Maybe they used 2. One didn't reach the target, theoretically, but they definitely used 1 Oreshnik and a bunch of missiles. Now, they won't be able to carry out such a massive attack for a while until they stockpile some more missiles again. So missiles will be flying. Yeah, there will be a few flying every day, maybe dozens, but it definitely won't be. There will be 90 missiles, maybe hundreds of drones a day, but it definitely won't be another 600 or 700 drones every day. Overall, if the Russians want to focus on Kyiv, according to their own words, then it's basically confirmation that they have no idea how to operate on the front anymore, that they're unable to break through the front line, and that they're stuck, just like the Ukrainians are also stuck on the front because there are too many drones, too much surveillance. Most of the soldiers who die because of drones, and on top of that, they die even before they reach the front line during the move to the zero line. So at this moment, advances there are more or less just in the range of tens to hundreds of meters, Territorial gains are minimal, Russian soldier losses are extreme, recruitment is lower than the losses. Therefore, even these threats clearly confirm that the Russians are desperate, that they're playing the intimidation card, that they're trying to scare, and that once again, when things aren't going their way and when something happens that's just propaganda-wise inconvenient for them, once again, when it looks like the front is screwed because their offensive is also stuck. By the way, the spring offensive is happening now, right? Somehow we haven't noticed. As for movement on the front. So once again, they're switching to that threatening mode. They're switching to threatening mode again, trying to sow fear. Fortunately, it's not working very well. Because, for example, the United States wasn't intimidated. Lavrov called the United States, spoke with Rubio, talked about attacks, and suggested that Americans might want to withdraw their people. And of course, besides that, he wanted to inform the Americans that some missiles might be used, which the Americans could theoretically assess as a possible threat to Europe or the United States. And this is something that is commonly done in this war, that when the Russians want to use some missiles or means that Europeans or Americans could theoretically assess as a possible risk of attacks on Europe or America, the Russians warn in advance to prevent something they really don't want, like a panicked reaction from some soldiers or commanders at sites for launching doomsday weapons or weapons used to destroy missiles that the Russians might use. In other words, by doing this, they are preventing not only a diplomatic but also a military incident where someone in the West might panic and assess the Russian ballistic missile attack on Ukraine as a possible risk for Europe or the United States. So this was communicated. Yeah, but at the same time, it's good to say that in America, this didn't really get much attention. America isn't afraid, but at the same time, it hasn't promised any help to Ukraine, unlike Europe and the European countries, which have said, yes, we'll go, we'll help, we'll hold the line. So America is still pushing for a peaceful solution. Otherwise, they're basically saying they don't care because the peace negotiations aren't moving anywhere and are completely, absolutely useless. Nevertheless, they weren't intimidated. They weren't intimidated. And besides that, of course, we also have a reaction in Congress, which is trying to push through some new aid for Ukraine. There are petitions being signed by Democrats, but also some Republicans, saying that more should be done to help Ukraine and that Trump should be blocked more, for example, regarding his lifting of sanctions on Russian oil and things like that. So in America, in Congress, something is happening as well. There's a buzz there. At the same time, regarding the nuclear weapon, it's important to mention that if a nuclear weapon were used, suddenly all these negotiations would fall apart. So the Russians wouldn't be able to play this cat and mouse game with the Americans anymore. And overall, it would put them in a worse position rather than a better one if they dropped a tactical nuclear bomb on Kyiv. Yes, Kyiv. That would be destructive for Russian efforts to do anything related to hybrid operations in Europe or to string the United States along. Yeah, no, a nuclear bomb really is unthinkable. It would be unstrategic. It's not a pragmatic decision. It would be completely stupid from every angle. So once again, you really don't have to worry about this, and Kyiv doesn't have to worry about it either. Kyiv now has to worry about concentrated attacks, which will be more frequent specifically on Kyiv and less so on some secondary cities. So, in summary, the Russians are trying to threaten because they're hysterical, since the war isn't going according to their plan. The Americans continue not to be intimidated and want to resolve this diplomatically. The Europeans continue not to be intimidated and want to keep supporting Ukraine both militarily and financially. Of course, Russian mill bloggers are hysterical and want to see some destruction, some results, because they're afraid that if that doesn't happen, there will be a mobilization. A mobilization that could and should affect them personally, which they definitely don't want. Then, of course, we have the problem that the Russians will most likely be targeting Kyiv. But this won't scare the people of Kyiv or Ukrainians because they've already been forged in the hell and fire of war. And even though, of course, there's some civil disobedience, dozens or even hundreds of people sometimes shout at recruiters when they behave badly and so on. There are also cases where Commander Syrskyi was called an idiot when he made a bad decision about how a unit would attack somewhere and it didn't work out. So, of course, there are problems here. There are divisions both among commanders in the army and among citizens. That's pretty common, but nothing too terrible. As for the nuke, it won't be used. As for attacks on civilian targets and focusing on Kyiv, that's a strategic mistake, a hysterical strategic mistake that already cost Hitler victory and everything. Again, it will work more as a unifying and bonding element for Ukrainians rather than bringing them to their knees. Overall, the logic that the Russians use that they will bring a defending nation to its knees after 5 years of war by bombing their cities is absolutely completely wrong. Instead, maybe they should focus on the fact that Russians who haven't been affected by the war for the last 5 years, if they didn't want to be, are now starting to feel the war, both because Ukrainians are attacking cities more and more often, and also because soldiers aren't coming home, losses are increasing, prices are rising, the availability of goods is decreasing, and all these things. So, in this regard, Russia has a much bigger problem with the stability of its own population than it is willing to admit. And it wants to create instability in Ukraine as well. But as I said, the last 5 years of war and pressure have united the Ukrainian nation into, well, if not a diamond, then something very solid that won't break under further pressure. So that's how it is, ladies and gentlemen. Support the unity of Europe. Support unity. Haha. Diplomatic solutions. Sorry, US diplomatic solutions, support Ukraine's resilience, and don't bow to aggression. Take care. Support this content as well through QR codes. Here you can send some shekels or even crowns, euros, but I don't accept rubles. You can also, of course, follow me on other social networks. Give a like here, share, or write a comment. If you haven't already, write an outraged comment about how I dared to say certain things, and we'll see each other again in the next videos. So take care, join the streams, and we keep going.